Day 8 began with the promise of change. I was heading back towards the mountains, though not before another long stretch of quiet roads. It also marked the beginning of the Ballyhoura Way, another chapter unfolding beneath my feet. I passed through Churchtown, where I stopped to rest and refuel before continuing on towards Ballyhoura. After carefully crossing the busy Cork-Limerick road, the trail softened again, following quiet paths through open farmland where the walking was easier and more natural. Later in the day, the route climbed into another large wind farm. While wind turbines in the mountains divide opinion, they bring one undeniable benefit: access. The service roads open up high ground that would otherwise be difficult to reach, making these mountains walkable in a new way. As I climbed higher into the Ballyhoura Mountains, I began to run low on water. Despite weeks of rain earlier in the journey, the streams were dry. Then, as so often happens on long trails, help appeared in the form of a stranger, a Scotsman who shared his own water and refilled my bottle without hesitation. Crossing the final summit of the day, I finally stepped out of my home county of Cork and into County Limerick, a quiet but meaningful boundary marking real progress northward. From there, I followed a mix of mountain bike trails and walking paths down to the Ballyhoura Mountain Bike Centre. I hoped to find a place to pitch my tent for the night. Instead, I found something even better: showers. After what had been my biggest day so far, standing under hot water felt like an unexpected luxury, a small reward at the end of a long day. The plan for day 9 was simple: walk a short distance, rest a little more and let the body recover. But the weather had other ideas. The morning started bright and clear and the sunshine inspired me. Instead of stopping early, I kept walking, drawn onward by the kind of day that feels too rare to waste in Ireland. The trail began gently through beautiful woodland, quiet and green, before returning again to stretches of road. By the time I arrived in Kilfinnan, the sun was high and bright. I stopped at Molly's Cafe for food, grateful for a proper meal. Once again though, the place listed for a passport stamp was closed. It was becoming a familiar pattern. Services marked on maps that no longer existed in reality. Beyond Kilfinnan, the route climbed steadily through woods, forestry tracks and quiet back roads. The stillness of the countryside was occasionally broken by sharp cracks echoing through the hills, the sound of gunfire from a nearby clay pigeon range. It's not a sound we're used to hearing in Ireland, and it carried strangely across the landscape, echoing through otherwise peaceful valleys. Descending into Ballylanders, I stopped to refill my water before continuing on towards Galbally. Along the way, locals stopped to ask me what I was doing, where I was headed, how far I'd come. They shared stories, bits of local history, and the kind of small town gossip that only locals truly know. Conversations like these became part of the journey, as memorable as any of the views. Later, I paused in a pub to watch a bit of a hurling match involving Limerick on the television. Then went searching for somewhere to camp. I found a quiet spot beside the local GAA pitch where the evening was passed in easy conversation with people out for a walk. By day 10, practicality began to call. I needed to recharge electronics, wash clothes and reset a little. So I booked a B&B in Tipperary town for the night, a decision that meant I couldn't simply keep wandering onward, as I'd begun to do whenever the weather was good. Today would be shorter whether I liked it or not. Leaving Galbally, the road rose gently uphill before giving way to farmland paths that were clearly cared for and well maintained. It was the kind of stretch that showed what's possible when walkers and landowners work together. Land shared rather than divided. Soon the route entered the Glen of Aherlow, where woodland trails replaced roads and the walking finally felt natural again. The nearby mountains remained mostly hidden behind trees, but it didn't matter. It was enough to just be off the tarmac, walking on paths made for feet rather than wheels. With the sun shining and fewer miles to cover, I slowed my pace and let the day stretch out. For once, there was no urgency, only the simple pleasure of moving through the landscape. The descent towards Tipperary town was long, much of it along roads, and the final stretch followed a particularly busy one. After the quiet calm of the day, the sudden rush of traffic felt jarring, almost intrusive. It was a sharp reminder of how quickly solitude can vanish. Eventually I reached my B&B, washed clothes, found food and settled into a bed. Another small luxury that long-distance walking teaches you never to take for granted. Morning began with a good breakfast and the familiar ritual of packing everything back into my bag. I left town along the Multeen Way, a section that quickly reminded me of the West Cork Way. Like that stretch, this felt less like a trail in its own right and more like a link joining other routes together. The morning passed mostly on roads with little to hold the eye. Just after Donahill, the trail turned off onto farmland tracks. If the roads had been hard underfoot, the fields proved harder still. The recent sunshine had baked ground solid, and hidden beneath long grass were deep holes left by tractors and cattle. More than once my ankle twisted unexpectedly, and by the end of the day my legs felt every misstep. There were curious cattle watching my progress throughout the day, and one encounter with 4 dogs that quickened my pace more than any hill could. Days like this test the walker differently, not with distance or weather, but with uneven ground and constant vigilance. By the time I reached Cappa White, I knew I needed to rest my ankles. I sat for a while weighing pride against practicality and eventually chose sense. I booked another B&B and called it a day early. The owners of the local shop kindly gave me a lift to my accommodation, a simple gesture that made all the difference. With my feet up for the rest of the afternoon, I watched the fine weather continue outside and knew I'd made the right choice. The next morning, I got a lift back to Cappa White and resumed the trail exactly where I'd left it. The day began with a steady climb, and with height came views. Wide, clear sights back across the Glen of Aherlow and the Galtee Mountains stretching across the distance. After days of mixed terrain and limited views, the openness felt like a reward. There was another long stretch through a wind farm, followed by more farmland walking. Eventually, this brought me to the end of the Multeen Way and the beginning of the next section, the Ormond Way. I couldn't say I was sorry to leave the previous stretch behind. The Ormond Way started across rough farmland where the ground once again proved difficult. The sun had hardened everything, turning the surface tough and unyielding, and every step demanded attention. I arrived into the village of Upperchurch to find once more that everything was closed. I sat in the sunshine and ate lunch outside a shut pub, beginning to wonder if the absence of open shops, restaurants and services along the route was telling a larger story. Many of the places listed as stops or stamp points on the trail's official information simply no longer seemed to exist or opened only occasionally. It made me think about rural Ireland and whether what I was seeing was temporary or part of a longer, quieter change. The route rose and fell along a mixture of roads and tracks until eventually I reached the village of Templederry. There I met the owner of the local pub and shop. A keen walker himself, he showed me a good place to pitch my tent. After some food, I settled onto a bar stool for a few well-earned pints and an easy conversation about walking, Ireland and the road I'd travelled so far. It was the perfect ending to the day, Miles behind me, miles ahead, and stories shared between. Day 13 brought another long stretch of road walking. There were off-road options, but locals warned me that many were still blocked or damaged after the recent storm. I don't mind the roads the way some walkers do. In fact, I'd begun to appreciate them. On roads, I found a rhythm. Steps became steady, breathing settled, and my thoughts drifted freely. Hours could pass in that state, moving forward almost automatically, as if walking itself had become a form of meditation. The landscape rolled by quietly, and my mind wandered wherever it pleased. At the top of a hill overlooking Tumavara, I stopped and looked out across the land ahead. It struck me then that most of the climbing was behind me now. The route was bending toward the River Shannon, towards lower ground, towards a different kind of walking. The mountains that had shaped the first weeks were slowly disappearing behind me. The kilometres slipped past almost unnoticed, merging into one another until I found myself arriving in Cloughjordan. Instead of pitching the tent, I treated myself to a room in Django's hostel in the eco-village. After days of steady movement, it felt good to pause somewhere built on the idea of living simply and intentionally, something the trail itself had already begun teaching me. Leaving Cloughjordan, I passed trees that had been torn down in the recent storm. I was walking in warm sunshine, but the sight of those fallen giants was a quiet reminder of nature's power. Further along, I encountered fallen trees of a different kind, ones cut deliberately. In places, paths were blocked, signs damaged or missing, and more than once it was only with the help of GPS that I managed to stay en route. There were stretches where electric fences seemed to block the way entirely, subtle signals that not every part of the trail existed in easy harmony with the land it crossed. Eventually, rather than risk another dead end or detour, I followed a cycle route for the final kilometres into Lurra. There, I found a small community shop run from the local centre by volunteers. Over the previous days I'd been thinking about rural decline, about the closed doors and quiet villages I'd passed through, but here was something different. A place alive with conversation and purpose. Some came in for supplies, others just for a chat, but everyone belonged. It felt less like a shop and more like a meeting point, a reminder that community can survive when people choose to keep it alive. That evening I pitched my tent in a small, beautiful campsite behind a local pub run on weekends by a young couple. Later, over a pint, I listened to locals talk about how good it felt to have somewhere to gather again. Their words carried a quiet pride, and I realised that trails don't just pass through places, they connect them. Day 15 was short and brought me to the halfway point on my journey. Crossing into Portumna, I stepped over the River Shannon. For the coming days, the route would follow the river's edge, offering a welcome change from the hills and climbs that had defined the first half of the journey. 2 weeks earlier, I had started out in relentless rain. Now the weather had turned, and the forecast promised dry, bright days ahead. Somewhere along the way, I'd slipped into that quiet rhythm familiar to long-distance walkers, the place where life becomes simple. Each day held only a few tasks. Wake, walk, eat, sleep. And that was enough.